discover the shattering truth behind Taehyung's cruel words that broke Jungkook. A deep, cinematic dive into a bond tested by secrets, sacrifice, and a lie. I never wanted you in this life, Jungkook. You were always just the shadow I had to carry. Taehyung's voice sliced through the freezing rain, colder than the ice forming on the Seoul pavement, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Jungkook stood paralyzed, the neon lights of the city blurring into jagged streaks of crimson and gold as the words anchored themselves in his chest like rusted hooks. He didn't just hear the words. He felt them dismantle the very foundation of his identity. Every shared memory of their decade-long brotherhood turning into ash before his eyes. The rain soaked through his thin jacket, but the chill he felt was internal. A sudden, violent numbing of the soul that made his knees buckle until he was kneeling in a puddle of dirty water, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Taehyung didn't turn back, his silhouette a sharp, unforgiving blade against the gray mist as he walked away, leaving Jungkook to shatter in the middle of an empty alleyway where they had once promised to conquer the world together. The breakdown was not a quiet thing. It was a visceral, uncontrollable storm of salt and grief that tore through Jungkook's lungs, his forehead pressed against the wet concrete as he let out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a wounded animal's lament. Every sob was a physical rejection of the reality he had just been handed, his mind racing through the thousands of nights Taehyung had stayed awake to calm his anxieties, and the countless times they had shared a single pair of headphones to escape the pressures of their skyrocketing fame. It didn't make sense, yet the coldness in Taehyung's eyes had been real, a dark, vacuous void, where there used to be warmth and protective fire. Jungkook's fingers clawed at the ground, his nails breaking against the stone, but he couldn't stop the mental loop of Taehyung's voice, flat, detached, and utterly devoid of the love that had been Jungkook's only North Star for years. As the hours bled into a feverish night, the narrative of their lives began to shift under the weight of a hidden truth that Jungkook was too broken to see. Behind the harsh facade, Taehyung was drowning in a different kind of darkness, a sacrificial play involving a massive blackmail scheme that threatened to destroy not just their group, but Jungkook's future specifically. Taehyung had discovered that a powerful corporate shadow was using their proximity to harvest information that would lead to a legal scandal tailored to frame Jungkook as the fall man. The only way to sever the connection and move the target off the younger man's back was to create a rift so deep and so public that they would no longer be seen as an inseparable unit. Taehyung had chosen to become the villain in Jungkook's story, to ensure that Jungkook actually had a story left to tell, practicing those cruel, life-altering lines in front of a mirror, until his own heart felt like it had turned to stone. Days later, the truth finally began to leak through the cracks of Taehyung's carefully constructed armor when Jungkook found a crumpled, water-stained letter hidden inside an old camera bag they used to share. In the frantic, shaky handwriting of a man who was losing his mind, Taehyung had detailed the threats, the names of the men in suits who followed them in the shadows, and a final, heartbreaking apology that explained the shadow comment was a code they had created as kids, a signal that meant, "Hide until I make it safe." The realization hit Jungkook with the force of a tidal wave, his grief instantly transforming into a desperate, burning clarity. He realized that while he was crying over the words, Taehyung was bleeding out in silence, bearing the weight of Jungkook's safety on shoulders that were already beginning to slump under the pressure of isolation. The final confrontation happened in the same alleyway, though the rain had been replaced by a biting, dry wind that carried the scent of winter. Taehyung was there, looking like a ghost of the man he used to be, his eyes sunken and his skin pale from the exhaustion of playing a part that was killing him from the inside out. Jungkook didn't approach him with anger or the tears of a victim. He walked toward him with the steady, grounded stride of someone who had looked into the abyss and recognized the person trying to pull him back. When Taehyung tried to repeat the lie, his voice cracking this time, Jungkook simply reached out and grabbed his shoulders, pulling him into a crushing embrace that broke the carefully maintained distance. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with betrayal, but thick with the unspoken promise that they would face the shadows together, no matter how long the night lasted. The resolution was not a simple return to how things were, but a graduation into a more complex, weathered form of loyalty. They spent the following months dismantling the threat piece by piece, fueled by the terrifying knowledge of how easily they could have lost each other to a well-placed lie. Jungkook still remembered the sting of those words, but they served as a reminder of the lengths Taehyung was willing to go to protect him, a scar that had healed into a mark of unbreakable strength. As they stood on a stage months later, bathed in the artificial glow of 1,000 lights, their eyes met in a brief, private moment of understanding. The world saw two superstars at the height of their power, but they saw two survivors who knew that the loudest cries often come before the most powerful silences, and that some bonds are forged not just in joy, but in the fire of a necessary heartbreak. The air inside the blacked-out SUV was thick with the scent of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of lingering adrenaline. Jungkook sat in the far corner of the leather seat, his eyes fixed on the blurred neon lights of Seoul streaking past the window like dying stars. Beside him, Taehyung was a ghost, his breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. The reconciliation in the rain had been a momentary fracture in a much larger, darker reality, and now that the heat of that embrace had faded, the cold terror of their situation began to settle into their bones. They couldn't speak, not here, not when every inch of their lives was potentially wired for sound by the very people Taehyung was trying to thwart. Jungkook reached out, his fingers brushing against Taehyung's sleeve, finding the older man's hand and squeezing it with a force that spoke of a desperate, newfound resolve. They arrived at the safe house, a nondescript apartment in a district where the buildings leaned against one another like tired giants. Once inside, Taehyung didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the shadows with a practiced, haunting familiarity, sweeping a small electronic device across the vents and behind the picture frames. Only when the device emitted a steady, reassuring green pulse did he finally collapse against the kitchen counter, the facade of the cold, distant idol finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Jungkook watched him, the sight of Taehyung's trembling hands sparking a protective fire in his chest that burned hotter than any grief he had felt hours prior. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a bridge, heavy with the weight of everything that had been sacrificed to keep Jungkook's name out of the headlines of a manufactured scandal. Taehyung began to talk, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to scratch at the very walls of the room. He detailed the Nexus Group, a shadowy conglomerate with deep roots in the entertainment industry that had been quietly harvesting data on their private lives for years. They hadn't just wanted money. They wanted leverage a way to control the cultural zeitgeist by holding its biggest icons hostage. They had chosen Jungkook as the target because of his perceived vulnerability, his heart-on-his-sleeve nature making him the perfect candidate for a frame-up involving a high-stakes gambling ring he had never even stepped foot in. Taehyung had been approached 3 weeks ago with a folder full of doctored photos and forged testimonies. The ultimatum was simple: distance himself from Jungkook and facilitate his isolation, or watch as the younger man was dragged through a legal mudslide that would end his career and potentially his freedom. As Jungkook listened, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He thought back to the Shadow Code, a secret they had forged as trainees when they were hiding from strict managers just to grab a late-night snack. You were always just the shadow I had to carry. It had been a brilliant, agonizing choice of words. To the world, it was a dismissal. To Jungkook, once the fog of pain cleared, it was a flare gun fired into the dark. It meant Taehyung was carrying the weight of the threat alone, and he needed Jungkook to hide in the periphery until the danger passed. But Jungkook was tired of hiding. He moved toward the counter, placing his hands over Taehyung's, stilling the tremors. He looked into Taehyung's eyes, seeing not the betrayer, but the brother who had been willing to let himself be hated if it meant the other stayed safe. The plan they began to craft in the dark hours before dawn was a dangerous game of double bluffs. They had to maintain the public image of their falling out. The world needed to believe the rift was real. They would have to perform on music shows and attend rehearsals while treating each other like strangers, all while secretly funneling information to a private investigator. Jungkook had contacted through a trusted, retired contact. The psychological toll was immediate. In the days that followed, the tension on set was palpable. Staff members whispered behind their hands as Jungkook purposefully walked in the opposite direction whenever Taehyung entered a room. The cameras caught every missed glance and every cold shoulder, fueling a media firestorm that painted a picture of a brotherhood in ruins. Internally, however, every hateful look was a calculated beat in a symphony of survival. Jungkook found himself living a double life that felt like walking on a razor's edge. By day, he played the part of the wounded, abandoned friend, his natural tendency to wear his heart on his sleeve making the performance disturbingly easy. He channeled his real exhaustion and his real fear into the role, allowing the public to see a man who was breaking apart. But by night, he was a silent shadow, scouring digital footprints and meeting with informants in the back of crowded internet cafes. He discovered that the Nexus Group was planning to leak the forged documents during an upcoming global awards ceremony, a move designed to maximize the shockwave and force a buyout of their management agency under duress. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was starting to manifest in physical ways. Jungkook's sleep was plagued by nightmares of the alleyway, the sound of Taehyung's manufactured cruelty echoing in his ears, until he woke up gasping for air. Taehyung was struggling even more. The role of the villain was a suit of armor that didn't fit, and it was chafing his soul raw. He had to endure the vitriol of fans who didn't understand the truth. His social media feeds becoming a toxic wasteland of accusations and disappointment. He became a recluse, retreating into a shell of silence that worried their other teammates, who remained largely in the dark to protect the integrity of the ruse. There were moments behind the scenes where the mask almost slipped. During a late-night practice session, as the music drifted into a somber melody, Taehyung caught Jungkook's reflection in the wall-to-wall mirrors. For a fleeting second, the practiced coldness vanished, replaced by a look of such profound longing and apology that Jungkook almost broke cover to hold him. Instead, he simply tightened his jaw and walked out, the sound of his own footsteps feeling like a countdown. As the date of the awards ceremony approached, they finally found the kill switch, a digital trail leading back to a disgraced former executive who had been feeding the Nexus Group internal schedules and private communication logs. It was the piece of evidence they needed to flip the narrative. They spent the final 48 hours in a feverish blur of activity, coordinating with a high-level legal team that operated outside the influence of their own agency, which they feared might be compromised. The plan was no longer just to survive. It was to dismantle the Nexus Group entirely, exposing their predatory practices to the world in a way that would make it impossible for them to ever threaten another artist again. It was a gamble that required absolute precision. If they moved too early, the evidence would be suppressed. If they moved too late, Jungkook's reputation would be incinerated on a global stage. The night of the ceremony arrived with a suffocating humidity that seemed to hang over the stadium. The atmosphere in the dressing room was electric with hidden meaning. Jungkook sat at his vanity, watching the stylist supply makeup to cover the dark circles under his eyes, circles that were very real. Taehyung was seated across the room, his eyes fixed on a script he wasn't really reading. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. Outside, thousands of fans screamed their names, unaware that they were about to witness either the destruction of a legacy or the ultimate act of defiance. Jungkook felt a vibration in his pocket, the signal from their legal team. The files had been uploaded to a secure, decentralized server, ready to be blasted to every major news outlet the moment the leak was attempted. When they finally took the stage, the energy was different than any performance they had ever given. There was a raw, jagged edge to their movements, a reflection of the war they were fighting beneath the surface. During a solo bridge where they usually stood back to back, the space between them felt like a canyon. Jungkook sang with a ferocity that startled the audience, his voice carrying the weight of every tear he had shed in that rain-slicked alleyway. As the final notes of their set faded, the giant screens behind them flickered. The Nexus Group was making their move, attempting to override the broadcast with the doctored footage. But instead of the scandal the conspirators had prepared, the screens erupted into a mosaic of the group's own internal emails, bank statements, and recorded threats. The silence that fell over the stadium was deafening. In that moment of collective shock, Jungkook finally turned to Taehyung. No longer the shadow, no longer the victim. He walked across the stage and stood firmly by his side. The world watched in real time as the rift dissolved, replaced by a unified front that was more powerful than anything the industry had ever seen. The men in suits in the VIP boxes scrambled for the exits, but the doors were already being held by authorities. The truth didn't just set them free, it leveled the playing field. As they walked off the stage together, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, replaced by a deep, weary peace. They had survived the lie, they had survived the truth, and most importantly, They had survived the silence. The transition from the blinding glare of the stage lights to the sterile, flickering fluorescence of the backstage corridor felt like a plunge into freezing water. The roar of the crowd was still a dull thrum in their bones, a chaotic vibration that refused to settle even as the heavy soundproof doors swung shut behind them. For a moment, the world was nothing but the sound of labored breathing and the rhythmic click of camera shutters from a distance. Jungkook's hand was still clamped firmly onto Taehyung's wrist, his grip so tight his knuckles were white, as if he feared that letting go would cause the older man to vanish into the shadows once more. Taehyung didn't pull away. He leaned into the contact, his body trembling with the aftershocks of a war that had been fought in the silence of his own mind for far too long. The other members were waiting in the private lounge, their faces a frantic mosaic of confusion, anger, and profound relief. Namjoon was the first to move, his usual composure shattered as he paced the small space, his phone still gripped in a white-knuckled fist. When he saw them enter together, finally he stopped dead. The air in the room was thick, charged with the weight of the secrets that had nearly suffocated them all. Yoongi stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes sharp and searching as they landed on Taehyung. There was a heartbeat of pure, agonizing silence before the dam finally broke. The questions didn't come as words at first, but as a collective, stumbling rush toward the center of the room, a tangle of limbs and muffled sobs as the group pulled themselves back into a single, cohesive unit. Taehyung collapsed into the center of the huddle, the strength that had carried him through the performance evaporating instantly. He began to speak, the words spilling out in a fractured, desperate torrent. Apologizing for the silence, for the cruelty, for the way he had forced them to watch him break Jungkook's heart. He explained the technicalities of the Nexus Group's surveillance, the way they had compromised his personal devices, and the terrifying precision of the blackmail that had turned his life into a scripted nightmare. He told them about the sleepless nights spent memorizing the legal threats, and the way he had practiced those soul-crushing words in the rain just to make sure they sounded real enough to save Jungkook. Every word was a confession, a stripping away of the mask he had been forced to wear, until there was nothing left but the raw, bruised truth of a man who had almost destroyed himself to save the person he loved most. Jungkook listened, his head bowed, his forehead resting against Taehyung's shoulder. The anger he thought he might feel, the resentment for being kept in the dark, never came. Instead, he felt a profound, aching humility. He realized that while he had been drowning in the sorrow of betrayal, Taehyung had been standing in the middle of a burning building, holding up the roof so it wouldn't crush him. The trauma of the alleyway, the memory of the rain, and the coldness in Taehyung's eyes didn't vanish, but they transformed. They became the scars of a battle won, rather than the fresh wounds of a war lost. He reached up, his hand found in the back of Taehyung's neck, pulling him closer into the shared warmth of the group. They stayed like that for a long time, 7 men anchored to each other while the world outside erupted into a frenzy of headlines and legal investigations. The weeks that followed were a blur of high-stakes litigation and psychological recovery. The Nexus Group's downfall was swift and spectacular, their intricate web of corruption unraveling under the weight of the evidence the duo had gathered. The disgraced executives were brought to justice, but the victory felt quiet, almost secondary to the internal work that had to be done. The public narrative shifted from a scandal to a story of unprecedented loyalty. But for Jungkook and Taehyung, the cameras didn't matter anymore. They retreated to a secluded villa in the mountains, away from the prying eyes of the media and the relentless pace of their careers. It was there, amidst the scent of pine and the stillness of the winter air, that they began the slow process of rebuilding what had been broken. There were moments of sudden, sharp regression. Sometimes, the sound of rain against the window would send Jungkook back to that alleyway, his breath hitching as the phantom echo of, "I never wanted you in this life," rang in his ears. In those moments, Taehyung was always there, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, steady presence of a man who was no longer playing a part. He would sit with Jungkook in the dark, talking about everything and nothing, replacing the poisonous memories with new, gentle ones. They talked about the shadow code again, reclaiming the word from the villains who had tried to weaponize it. They decided that being a shadow wasn't about being a burden. It was about being the constant, silent companion to the light. A proof of existence that couldn't be severed. The depth of their psychological connection deepened into something telepathic. They learned to read the micro-expressions of exhaustion and the subtle shifts in mood that signaled a looming memory. Taehyung's guilt was a stubborn beast, one that Jungkook had to fight with a fierce, unwavering kindness. He reminded Taehyung every day that the villain he had played was a ghost, and that the man who had stood on that stage to expose the truth was the only one who mattered. They spent their days walking through the frost-covered woods, the crunch of snow under their boots, providing a grounding rhythm to their conversations. They rediscovered the simple joys they had nearly lost cooking together without a schedule. Listening to music without analyzing the lyrics for hidden threats, and simply existing in a space where they didn't have to be icons. As the winter began to thaw, a new sense of purpose emerged. They realized that their experience had given them a unique power to change the industry that had nearly swallowed them whole. They began to work quietly with legal advocates to create better protections for young artists, ensuring that no one else would ever have to choose between their career and their soul. The bond between them, once tested by the ultimate lie, had become a fortress. They returned to the city not as the boys they were, but as men who understood the true cost of protection and the absolute necessity of trust. The shadow had finally stepped into the light, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt like a place where they could finally breathe without fear. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a sanctuary they had built together, brick by emotional brick, and it was unbreakable. The transition from the absolute stillness of the mountain retreat back to the cacophonous pulse of soul felt like stepping from a black and white film into a world of hyper-saturated neon. The car ride back was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had haunted them months prior. It was a silence of preparation, of two people who had spent their time in the woods suturing their wounds and were now ready to see if the stitches would hold under the pressure of the world's gaze. Jungkook watched the cityscape rise to meet them, the glass skyscrapers reflecting a sunset that bled orange and violet across the horizon. His hand rested on the center console, and Taehyung's hand was draped over it, a constant, grounding weight that reminded him that the isolation of the past was over. They were no longer two boys running from a storm. They were the storm itself, redirected and refined into a force of change. The first day back in the recording studio was greeted by the smell of ozone, expensive coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of old dust that seemed to inhabit every creative space. The red, on-air light above the door felt like a judging eye at first, a reminder of the thousands of hours they had spent performing versions of themselves for the public. Jungkook stepped into the booth, the heavy foam-padded door clicking shut and cutting off the world. He adjusted the headphones, the cool plastic pressing against his ears, and looked through the glass at Taehyung, who sat on the sofa in the control room. There was no script today, no doctored footage, and no blackmail hanging over their heads. There was only the track, a haunting, stripped-back melody they had composed together during the long winter nights in the mountains. Ween Jungkook began to sing. His voice didn't have the polished, effortless sheen of his earlier hits. It was raspier, carrying the texture of the rain and the grit of the alleyway. The lyrics were a visceral map of his descent and subsequent climb. The words you planted in the garden of my heart grew into thorns, but even thorns have a purpose when the world tries to touch what is sacred. In the control room, Taehyung closed his eyes, his head tilted back as the sound of Jungkook's voice washed over him. He could hear every fracture and every mended piece in that melody. It was a terrifyingly honest piece of art. One that stripped away the idol persona and left behind two humans who had been broken and chose to forge something stronger from the shards. They spent 18 hours in that room, chasing the perfect take not for the sake of the charts, but for the sake of the truth.
As the news of their return began to circulate, the industry felt a seismic shift. The Nexus Group's dissolution had left a power vacuum that was being filled by a new wave of transparency. Jungkook and Taehyung didn't just return to their roles as performers, they became the faces of a movement. They spent their afternoons in glass-walled boardrooms, meeting with legal advocates and young trainees who looked at them with a mixture of awe and fear. Jungkook remembered the look in the eyes of a 15-year-old trainee who asked him how he knew who to trust. He had knelt down to the boys' level, his voice steady and devoid of the star artifice. "Trust isn't something you find," he had said. "It's something you build in the dark when everything else is burning. If someone is willing to let the world hate them to keep you safe, that's where you start." The night of their first comeback performance arrived with a global expectation that felt like a physical weight on the stadium roof. The dressing room was a flurry of activity, stylists, managers, and security detail moving in a synchronized dance. But amidst the chaos, Jungkook and Taehyung found a pocket of stillness in the corner. Taehyung reached out to straighten the collar of Jungkook's jacket, his fingers lingering on the fabric. The shadow comment still echoed in the back of their minds sometimes, a ghost that visited in the quiet moments, but today they were going to lay it to rest. They weren't going to perform a rift, they were going to perform a resurrection. When the stage floor rose and the first notes of their new anthem vibrated through the floorboards, the scream from the crowd was a tidal wave of sound. But as the lights hit them, a strange thing happened. The stadium went almost entirely silent. The audience wasn't just cheering, they were witnessing something raw. Jungkook and Taehyung stood center stage, bathed in a single, piercing white spotlight that cast long, dramatic shadows behind them. They didn't move toward each other immediately. They sang from opposite sides of the stage, their voices weaving a narrative of distance and longing, reflecting the weeks they spent as strangers. The choreography was sharp, aggressive, and laden with the symbolism of the struggle they had endured, the pushing away, the falling, and the desperate reach for a hand that wasn't allowed to be there. The climax of the song brought them together at the center of the stage. As the music swelled into a cinematic crescendo of strings and heavy percussion, they locked eyes. This wasn't the practiced gaze of two idols. This was the look of two survivors who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to climb back up together. When Jungkook hit the final soaring note, he didn't look away. He stepped forward, and for a brief, unscripted second, he rested his forehead against Taehyung's. The cameras caught it, a moment of profound, quiet intimacy that no amount of PR could ever manufacture. In that moment, the shadow was no longer a burden or a code for danger. It was simply a part of the light. The aftermath of the performance was a blur of tears and adrenaline. Backstage, the other members were waiting, and this time, the embrace was jubilant rather than desperate. They had done more than just save Jungkook's career. They had reclaimed their agency over their own lives. As the weeks turned into months, the scars of the Nexus Group scandal began to fade, replaced by a legacy of resilience. Jungkook still had nights where the sound of rain made his heart race, and Taehyung still carried a lingering guilt that he had to fight back with every smile Jungkook gave him. But they handled it together. On the final night of their world tour, they stood on the rooftop of the highest building in Seoul, looking out over the city that had nearly broken them. The wind was cold, but they didn't mind. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the neon lights of the city below looking like a sea of diamonds. Jungkook took a deep breath, the air clean and sharp in his lungs. He looked at Taehyung, whose profile was etched in the silver glow of the moon. "We made it," Jungkook whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the city. Taehyung turned to him, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips, a smile that finally reached his eyes. "We didn't just make it, Jungkook," Taehyung replied, reaching out to clasp his hand. "We redefined what it means to stay." They stood there for a long time, two figures silhouetted against the infinite glow of the world, finally at peace with the shadows they carried. The quiet that followed the conclusion of their world tour was not the hollow, frightening silence of the past, but a rich, resonant stillness that allowed the soul to finally catch up with the body. They had retreated to a studio hidden in the outskirts of a quiet coastal town, where the sound of the salt-thickened wind against the glass was the only rhythm they had to follow. Inside the room, the air was warm and smelled of old paper, cedarwood, and the faint, metallic scent of overheating vacuum tubes from their vintage amplifiers. Jungkook sat at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys like a bird deciding where to land. He wasn't playing for an audience of millions. He was playing for the man sitting on the floor beside him, surrounded by scattered lyric sheets and the soft glow of a single amber lamp. Taehyung was staring at a line he had written weeks ago, a fragment of the darkness he had lived through. A mask is a heavy thing to wear when the person you're hiding from is the only one who can see you. He looked up as Jungkook struck a chord, a deep, melancholic D minor that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. The melody was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of everything they had survived. It was the beginning of their final collaborative piece for this era, a song they had tentatively titled the Penumbra. In astronomy, the penumbra is the partially shaded outer region of a shadow, the place where light and dark bleed into one another until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. It was the perfect metaphor for their lives. Jungkook began to hum, a low, vibration-filled sound that resonated in his chest. He thought about the trainee he had spoken to months ago, the boy with the frightened eyes who wanted to know how to find trust. He realized then that his and Taehyung's story wasn't just a private victory. It was a blueprint. They spent hours in that room, dismantling the song and putting it back together, arguing over the bridge and the way the percussion should feel like a heartbeat recovering from a panic attack. There was no pressure from the agency, no looming threat from the Nexus group, and no need to perform a version of themselves. They were just two artists in a room, using their trauma as the raw material for something beautiful. The song evolved into a sweeping, cinematic journey. It started with a single, lonely violin that mimicked the sound of the rain in the alleyway, the high, piercing note of Jungkook's initial heartbreak. But as the track progressed, a second instrument entered, a cello that provided a grounding, darker counterpoint, representing Taehyung's silent sacrifice. The two melodies danced around each other, never quite touching, reflecting the weeks of forced distance before finally merging into a powerful, harmonious resolution. Jungkook's lyrics moved away from the pain of the betrayal and toward the strength found in the reconstruction. "You tried to save me by becoming the dark," he sang, his voice catching on the final syllable, "but you forgot that I've always been able to see in the night." One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and turned the sea into a sheet of liquid copper, they invited the group of trainees from their agency to the studio. These were the next generation, the ones who would inherit the industry they had fought so hard to change. Jungkook didn't stand at the front like a lecturer. He sat on the edge of the mixing desk, his legs swinging, while Taehyung leaned against the doorframe, watching with a quiet, observant pride. They played the Penumbra for the boys, the raw, unmastered version that still had the sounds of their breathing and the creak of the piano stool in the background. When the music stopped, the silence in the room was profound. A young trainee, no older than 16, raised his hand with a trembling uncertainty. "Does it ever go away?" he asked, his voice small. "The fear that someone will use your heart against you." Jungkook looked at Taehyung, a silent conversation passing between them in a heartbeat. Taehyung was the one who answered, his voice deep and steady, carrying the authority of a man who had walked through fire. "No," Taehyung said, "the fear doesn't go away, but you learn that your heart isn't a weakness, it's a compass. The people who try to use it against you are the ones who are lost. If you stay true to the people who would bleed in silence for you, you'll never be truly broken." The impact of their words was visible in the way the young boys stood a little straighter, the way the tension in their shoulders eased. Jungkook and Taehyung were no longer just idols to them. They were architects of a safer world. As the trainees left, bowing deeply with a newfound respect that went beyond fame, Jungkook felt a sense of closure that the world tour hadn't quite provided. They had taken the most painful moment of their lives, that freezing night in the rain, and turned it into a shield for others. The legacy wasn't the records they broke or the stadiums they sold out. It was the fact that the next generation wouldn't have to fear the shadows quite as much as they did. That evening they walked down to the beach. The tide was coming in, the waves licking at the sand with a rhythmic, soothing hiss. The air was cold, but Jungkook didn't shiver. He felt the weight of Taehyung's hand on his shoulder, a solid, immovable presence. They didn't talk about the Nexus group or the legal battles or the shadow code. They talked about the future, about the music they wanted to make when they were old, about the travels they would take when the world finally stopped watching them so closely, and about the simple, quiet life they had fought so hard to earn. Jungkook looked out at the horizon, where the line between the sky and the sea had vanished into a deep, velvety indigo. He realized that the uncontrollable crying he had experienced in that alleyway wasn't the end of his story. It was the breaking of a shell. He had been a boy who needed protection, and through the fire of Taehyung's sacrifice, he had become a man who could offer it. He reached out and traced a line in the wet sand, a simple circle that the next wave would wash away. It didn't matter that the mark was temporary. The fact that he was here to make it, standing beside the brother who had nearly lost everything to keep him safe, was the only truth that remained. As the stars began to poke through the darkness, looking like tiny pinpricks of light in a vast, dark canvas, Taehyung turned to him. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the ocean. Jungkook smiled, a real, radiant expression that lit up his entire face, mirroring the stars above. "Yeah," Jungkook replied, and for the first time in years the word felt like it was carved from solid stone. "I'm more than okay. I'm home." They stood there for a long time, two souls finally in sync, watching the tide come in and wash away the last of the footprints, leaving the beach smooth, clean, and ready for whatever story they decided to write next. The transition from the salt-sprayed solitude of the coast back to the architectural grandeur of Seoul felt like a symphony moving from a solo violin to a full, thunderous orchestra. The charity gala, titled the Blue Moon Initiative, was more than just a performance. It was the formal unveiling of the foundation Jungkook and Taehyung had established to protect young artists from the predatory shadows they had barely escaped. The venue was an architectural marvel, a glass-domed conservatory where the moonlight filtered through the transparent ceiling, mixing with the soft, ethereal blue glow of the stage lights. As the guests began to arrive, men in tailored suits and women in flowing silks, the air crackled with a different kind of tension. It wasn't the frantic energy of a comeback or the desperate fear of a scandal. It was the heavy, respectful anticipation of a turning point in history. Backstage, the atmosphere was hushed, almost sacred. Jungkook stood before a tall, ornate mirror, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was watching Taehyung through the glass. Taehyung was adjusting his cuffs, his movements slow and deliberate, a far cry from the trembling man who had collapsed in a kitchen months ago. Jungkook walked over, his boots silent on the plush carpet, and placed a hand on Taehyung's shoulder. There was no need for words. The shadow code was dead, buried under the weight of their shared truth, replaced by a telepathy born from surviving the impossible. They looked at each other, and in that gaze, Jungkook saw the entire map of their journey. The rain-slicked alleyway, the cold words, the sacrificial silence, and the eventual, hard-won light. When the lights in the conservatory dimmed, a hush fell over the audience that was so absolute it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock somewhere in the hall. A single spotlight, soft and pale as moonlight, illuminated a grand piano in the center of the circular stage. Jungkook sat down, his presence commanding yet grounded. He didn't begin with a grand greeting or a flashy opening. He simply let his fingers fall onto the keys, striking a chord that felt like a question asked in the middle of a long night. It was the first time the penumbra would be heard by the world, and the music carried the scent of cedarwood and the memory of the coastal wind. Taehyung emerged from the shadows as the first verse began. His voice was a deep, resonant cello, vibrating with an honesty that stripped the room of its artifice. He sang about the weight of the mask, about the terrifying moment he had to choose between Jungkook's heart and Jungkook's safety. As he moved closer to the piano, the choreography was minimal but profoundly symbolic. It was a dance of approach and retreat, a physical manifestation of the push and pull of their ordeal. Jungkook's voice joined his in the chorus, their harmonies blending with a precision that was less about technical skill and more about a soul-deep alignment. The lyrics spoke of the penumbra, the place where the shadow ends and the light begins, and how they had decided to live in that middle ground, where truth is messy but real. The climax of the performance was not a roar, but a crescendo of emotional clarity. As the strings of the live orchestra swelled behind them, the glass dome above seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of their unity. The audience didn't cheer. Many were in tears, realizing that they weren't just watching a performance but a public exorcism of a private trauma. When the final note faded, leaving only the echo of the piano's resonance, Jungkook and Taehyung stood center stage, their hands finally finding each other in the dim light. They didn't bow to the applause, they bowed to each other, a private acknowledgement of a debt that had been paid in full. In the months that followed the gala, the industry underwent a radical transformation. The foundation they started became a sanctuary, a place where the shadows were brought into the light and dismantled. Jungkook found himself spending more time in the foundation's library than in the recording studio, mentoring young artists who had been told their vulnerability was a liability. He taught them that the most powerful thing an artist can own is their story, especially the parts that are stained with tears. Taehyung, meanwhile, became the architect of new legal frameworks, using the very files that had once been used to blackmail him as a blueprint for protection. They were no longer just idols. They were the guardians of the culture that had nearly consumed them. One evening, long after the gala had become a legendary footnote in music history, Jungkook and Taehyung found themselves back in that same alleyway where it had all begun. It was raining again, a soft, misty drizzle that turned the neon lights into blurred watercolor paintings on the pavement. They weren't there to mourn or to revisit the pain. They were there to reclaim the space. Jungkook stood in the exact spot where he had knelt in the dirty water, but this time, he was standing tall. He looked at Taehyung, who was leaning against the same brick wall, a soft smile on his face. "It looks different now," Jungkook said, his voice steady. Taehyung nodded, stepping into the rain to stand beside him. "The shadows are gone, Jungkook, it's just an alleyway now." They walked out of the alleyway together, their shoulders brushing, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that was finally their own. The world was still loud, still chaotic, and still full of people who would try to build their empires on the backs of others. But as they emerged into the bright, crowded streets of the city, they knew they were no longer afraid. They had survived the lie, they had mastered the truth, and they had turned their darkest hour into a beacon for everyone else lost in the dark. The shadow was no longer something to be carried. It was a part of the light they cast, a reminder of where they had been and a promise of where they were going. They vanished into the crowd, two men among millions, but with a bond that was, and would always be, unbreakable. The city lights eventually faded into a soft, rhythmic blur of starlight and coastal fog, as the car climbed the winding roads leading back toward the ocean. This journey was different. It wasn't a flight from danger or a desperate search for a sanctuary, but a conscious choice to return to the place where their new lives had truly begun. Jungkook sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against the cool glass of the window, watching the moonlight dance over the dark, restless surface of the sea. Beside him, Taehyung drove with a relaxed confidence, his hands steady on the steering wheel, the sharp, anxious edges of his silhouette having long since softened into something grounded and enduring. The silence between them was no longer a minefield of unspoken fears, but a vast, open landscape where they could finally exist without the need for performance or protection. When they reached the house on the cliff, the air was sharp with the scent of wild rosemary and salt. The house stood like a silent sentinel against the elements, its windows reflecting the silver glow of a moon that seemed to hang lower and brighter than usual. They didn't go inside immediately. Instead, they walked down the familiar, narrow path to the private stretch of beach below, the sand cold and yielding beneath their feet. Jungkook stopped at the water's edge, watching the white foam of the tide rush in to lick at his boots before retreating back into the infinite dark. He thought back to the first time he had stood here, his chest hollow with the echo of Taehyung's manufactured cruelty, and he marveled at how much the weight of that memory had changed. It was no longer a stone that dragged him down. It was the foundation upon which he had built a version of himself that was no longer fragile. Taehyung stood a few paces behind him, his coat billowing slightly in the wind. He was watching Jungkook with an expression that was a complex blend of pride and a lingering, quiet reverence. He remembered the exact moment he had decided to utter those words in the alleyway, the way his heart had felt like it was being physically crushed in a vice, the way he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from sobbing as he watched Jungkook crumble. For a long time, Taehyung had feared that even with the truth revealed, the stain of that moment would never truly leave them. He had feared that every time Jungkook looked at him, he would see the ghost of the betrayer. But as Jungkook turned toward him now, his eyes bright with a calm, steady light, Taehyung realized that they had done the impossible. They had taken a weapon intended to destroy them and turned it into a forge. They spent the night in the living room, the only light coming from the embers in the fireplace, and the pale moon filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They talked about the foundation, which had grown into a global network that was successfully challenging the archaic power structures of the industry. They spoke about the letters they received daily from young artists who had found the courage to speak their own truths because of the path Jungkook and Taehyung had paved. But mostly, they talked about the future, the music that was no longer about the struggle to survive, but the joy of being found. Jungkook shared a melody he had been humming since they left Seoul, a bright, soaring theme that felt like the first breath of spring after a decade of winter. It was a sound of liberation, a sonic representation of the moment the shadow finally loses its power over the light. As the first hints of dawn began to bruise the horizon with shades of indigo and pale gold, Jungkook finally addressed the one thing they had never fully laid to rest. He asked Taehyung if he still carried the guilt of the lie. Taehyung was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dying embers. He admitted that there were still nights when he woke up hearing the sound of Jungkook's uncontrollable crying, a sound that felt like a permanent scar on his conscience. Jungkook moved across the rug, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, and he took Taehyung's hand. He told him that those tears were necessary, that they were the water that had allowed the truth to grow. He explained that he didn't want Taehyung to forget that night, but he wanted him to stop punishing himself for it. The pain was the price of their freedom, and it was a price Jungkook would pay 1,000 times over to be standing where they were now. The sunrise was spectacular, a slow-motion explosion of crimson and orange that set the sea on fire. They stood on the deck together, coffee mugs steaming in the cold morning air, watching the world wake up. The fear of the Nexus group, the trauma of the blackmail, and the suffocating pressure of their former lives felt like a dream from a different lifetime. They were no longer defined by what had happened to them, but by what they were choosing to create. The shadow was now nothing more than a part of the landscape, a reminder that light requires a background to be seen. They had moved beyond the penumbra and into the full, blinding clarity of their own shared identity. Before they left to return to the city and begin work on their most ambitious project yet, a dual album that would serve as a manifesto for the foundation, they performed a final, private ritual. They took the old, water-stained letter Taehyung had written in the dark, the one that had first revealed the truth to Jungkook, and they set it on fire in the hearth. They watched as the frantic, shaky handwriting curled and blackened, turning into ash that was swept up the chimney and out into the vast, indifferent sky. It was the final act of letting go. The story of their heartbreak was over. The story of their legacy was just beginning. They walked back to the car, their hands entwined, ready to face the world not as idols in a gilded cage, but as architects of a new, kinder reality. The heavy, mechanical hum of the rain machines provided a white noise backdrop to the tension that sat like a physical weight in the center of the narrow Seoul alleyway. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and the air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the ozone-heavy breath of the massive lighting rigs suspended above the buildings. For anyone else, this was just a film set, a highly controlled environment designed to capture a moment of cinematic heartbreak for a music video. But for Jungkook, standing in the exact spot where his world had once splintered into a million jagged pieces, it felt like stepping back into a wound that had never truly closed. He could feel the cold water seeping through his thin shirt, a sensory trigger that sent a jolt of phantom pain through his chest. He looked up, and there, walking toward him through the artificial mist, was Taehyung, dressed in the same dark overcoat he had worn on that life-altering night. The director called for silence, a command that seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the air. This was the pivotal scene of the video, the reenactment of the betrayal that had been the Foundation's genesis. Taehyung stopped 3 paces away, his face a masterpiece of practiced, icy detachment. The camera circled them like a predator, its lens capturing every micro-expression. Taehyung opened his mouth, and the words that had once destroyed Jungkook spilled out again, amplified by the silence of the crew. "I never wanted you in this life, Jungkook. You were always just the shadow I had to carry." The delivery was identical to the original, flat, cruel, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had defined their decade of brotherhood. Jungkook felt the familiar, uncontrollable surge of grief rise in his throat. Even though he knew the truth now, even though he knew Taehyung had said those words to save him from the Nexus Group's blackmail, the sheer power of the delivery was overwhelming. He didn't have to act the breakdown. His knees buckled of their own accord, hitting the wet pavement with a dull thud. He let the tears come, a visceral, salt-heavy flood that mixed with the artificial rain. But this time, the crying was different. It wasn't the sound of a boy being discarded. It was the sound of a man purging the last remnants of a trauma that had been held in the dark for too long. He wasn't just crying for the character in the video. He was crying for the version of himself that had been left in that alleyway months ago. When the director finally shouted cut, and the rain machines hissed into a sudden, jarring silence, the atmosphere on set remained frozen. The crew, many of whom knew the whispered rumors of the real-life rift, stood motionless, caught in the raw gravity of what they had just witnessed. Taehyung didn't wait for the stylists to rush in with towels. He immediately dropped the persona, his face fracturing into an expression of profound, aching empathy. He knelt in the water beside Jungkook, pulling him into a fierce, silent embrace. The warmth of Taehyung's body was a stark contrast to the freezing artificial rain, a living proof that the words they had just spoken were nothing more than ghosts. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 figures huddled together in the middle of a fake storm, proving that the strongest bonds are the ones that can withstand the weight of their own history. The release of the dual album, anchored by the music video for The Penumbra, acted as a final, definitive blow to the old guard of the industry. It wasn't just a commercial success. It was a cultural reckoning. The world saw the alleyway scene and finally understood the depth of the sacrifice that had been made. The video became a symbol of transparency, sparking a global conversation about the mental health of artists and the predatory nature of corporate surveillance. Jungkook and Taehyung found themselves at the center of a storm of a different kind, one of adoration and respect that was no longer built on the shallow foundation of celebrity, but on the undeniable truth of their character. They spent the following months traveling, not for a tour, but for the Foundation, establishing safe haven centers in cities across the globe. In a quiet moment during their visit to the Paris branch of the Foundation, Jungkook sat in a sun-drenched library, watching a group of young musicians collaborate in a corner. The space was filled with the sound of a cello and a flute, a hopeful, improvisational melody that felt like a far cry from the dark halls of the Nexus Group. He realized then that their story had become a living thing, something that breathed and grew independently of them. Taehyung walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and sat down beside him. He looked out the window at the Parisian skyline, the Eiffel Tower silhouetted against a soft, lavender dusk. They didn't talk about the video or the alleyway. They talked about the kids they were helping, the lives they were changing, and the strange, beautiful way the universe had turned their greatest tragedy into their greatest contribution. As the years began to pass, the intensity of their fame evolved into a steady, respected legacy. They continued to make music, but the pressure to top the charts had been replaced by a desire to explore the nuances of the human experience. They became the elder statesmen of the industry, the ones who were called upon to mediate disputes and protect the vulnerable. The shadow comment, once a source of such profound pain, had become a joke between them, a shorthand for the lengths they would go to for one another. Whenever one of them was feeling overwhelmed or exhausted, the other would simply whisper, "Don't worry, you're just the shadow I have to carry," followed by a laugh that erased the last of the old ghosts. The final chapter of their public journey culminated in a quiet, untelevised concert held at the Foundation's headquarters in Seoul. It was an intimate affair, attended only by the staff, the trainees, and their closest friends. There were no cameras, no pyrotechnics, and no elaborate costumes. Just 2 stools, a piano, and a single acoustic guitar. They played through their entire history, from the early days of their debut to the dark nights of the blackmail, and finally to the bright, open future they had built. When they reached the final song, a new piece they had written specifically for the occasion, the room was filled with a sense of peace that felt like a physical presence. The lyrics of the final song were a simple, profound meditation on the nature of light and shadow. "We spent so much time afraid of the dark," Jungkook sang, his voice now deeper and more resonant with the wisdom of age, "that we forgot the stars only shine because of it." Taehyung joined him for the harmony, their voices as perfectly synchronized as they had ever been. "The shadow wasn't a burden," they sang together. "It was the proof that we were standing in the light." The song ended on a soft, unresolved chord that seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that their story was never truly finished, but simply moving into a new, quieter phase. As the guests drifted away and the lights in the hall were dimmed, Jungkook and Taehyung stood on the balcony overlooking the city they had conquered and then reclaimed. The Seoul skyline was a sea of lights, a vibrant, pulsing organism that had once seemed so threatening and was now just a backdrop to their lives. Jungkook leaned against the railing, feeling the cool night air on his face. He looked at Taehyung, who was staring out at the horizon with a look of absolute contentment. They had survived the rain, the lies, and the silence. They had built something that would outlast their fame and their voices. They stood there in the quiet, 2 survivors who had found their way back to each other, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would never have to face it as shadows again. They were finally, fully, and undeniably home. The gold leaf lettering on the mahogany doors of the Safe Haven International headquarters caught the afternoon sun, casting long, elegant reflections across the marble foyer that hummed with the quiet industry of a world being rebuilt. It had been 15 years since the rain-slicked pavement of that Seoul alleyway had threatened to swallow Jungkook's soul, and today, the air felt different, lighter, filled with the scent of jasmine and the distant, melodic echoes of a cello being tuned in one of the conservatory wings. Jungkook stood by the high windows of the executive floor, his silhouette sharper now, his presence carrying the quiet authority of a man who had not only survived a storm but had learned to command the winds. He watched the younger generation of artists, the children of the legacy he and Taehyung had forged, moving through the gardens with a freedom he hadn't known at their age, a freedom that had been bought with the currency of his own tears. Taehyung entered the room with the silent grace of a ghost who had finally found peace, his footsteps muffled by the thick indigo carpet. He carried a leather-bound folder, but his eyes were fixed on Jungkook. The silence between them was a living thing, a tapestry woven from 1,000 shared glances and the heavy, sacred knowledge of everything they had sacrificed. Taehyung leaned against the window frame, his gaze following Jungkook's out toward the horizon where the city skyline met the sea. They were no longer the frantic, hunted idols of the Nexus Group era. They were the architects of a sanctuary, and today was the graduation of the first class of students who had completed the full emotional and legal curriculum of the Foundation. It was the physical manifestation of the promise they had made to each other in that small coastal house a lifetime ago. The graduation ceremony was held in the central amphitheater, a space designed with acoustics that made even a whisper feel like a profound truth. As Jungkook stood behind the podium, he looked out at the faces of 30 young men and women, each representing a different corner of the global industry. He saw the same hunger in their eyes that he had once possessed, but he also saw something else, a lack of the hollow, bone-deep fear that had nearly destroyed him. He didn't deliver a traditional speech. Instead, he told them the story of the shadow. He spoke about the night the world ended for him, the night his brother had used words like a scalpel to cut him away from a dangerous reality. He watched as the students leaned in, their breath catching as he described the visceral, uncontrollable breakdown that had become the foundation's cornerstone. Taehyung stood in the wings, watching Jungkook with a pride that was so intense it felt like a physical ache in his chest. He remembered the weight of the rain, and the way his own heart had seemed to stop beating the moment he turned his back on Jungkook in that alley. He realized then that the most powerful thing they had ever created wasn't a song or a performance, but the courage to be seen in their most broken states. When Jungkook finished his story, the silence in the theater was so profound it felt like a prayer. It was broken not by applause, but by a young girl in the front row, Hana, a prodigy who had survived her own industry scandal, who stood up and simply bowed. One by one, the other students followed, a silent acknowledgement of the debt they owed to the two men who had turned their tragedy into a shield. After the ceremony, they found themselves in the Foundation's private archives, a room filled with the physical history of their struggle. On the center table sat the original camera bag, the one where Jungkook had found the letter that changed everything. Jungkook ran his fingers over the worn leather, his touch gentle, almost reverent. He looked at Taehyung and asked a question he hadn't dared to voice in years. If they could go back to that night, knowing the cost, would he do it again? Taehyung didn't hesitate. He walked over and placed his hand over Jungkook, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried the weight of a decade and a half of healing. He said that he would endure the silence, the guilt, and the hatred a million times over just to see Jungkook standing here, whole and unafraid. The evening sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the archives in shades of burnt amber and deep violet. They decided to walk through the gardens one last time before the celebratory gala. The air was cooling, and the sound of the ocean was a constant, rhythmic heartbeat in the distance. As they passed the fountain, a group of trainees was sitting on the grass, laughing and sharing headphones. They didn't scramble to stand or hide their phones. They simply waved, a gesture of casual, profound respect that made Jungkook's heart swell. This was the world they had built, a world where the shadow was no longer a threat, but a place of rest. They reached the edge of the cliff, the same spot where they had once watched the tide come in and wash away their footprints. The world was vast and dark before them, the stars beginning to prick through the velvet sky like tiny, distant fires. Jungkook leaned his head against Taehyung's shoulder, the familiar scent of sandalwood and cold air grounding him. He realized that the uncontrollable crying in the alleyway hadn't been an end, but a beginning, a shedding of a skin that was too small for the man he was meant to become. The pain had been a bridge, and they had crossed it together, hand in hand, leaving the ghosts of the Nexus group and the shadows of their former lives far behind. The future stretched out before them, no longer a terrifying void but a canvas of infinite possibility. They talked about the next phase of the Foundation, about expanding the safe haven centers into the most remote parts of the world, and about the new music they were writing, music that finally felt like it belonged to them alone. The shadow was now just a word, a memory of a code that had served its purpose and been laid to rest. As the moon rose, casting a silver path across the restless sea, they turned back toward the lights of the headquarters. They were the architects of the light, the guardians of the truth, and most importantly, they were two brothers who had walked through the fire and emerged not just unburnt, but refined. As they reached the heavy mahogany doors once more, Jungkook stopped and looked back at the ocean. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The tears of the past had watered the seeds of a future that was more beautiful than anything he could have imagined in his darkest hour. He took a deep breath, the salt-thickened air filling his lungs, and smiled at Taehyung. There were no more secrets, no more lies, and no more shadows to carry. They stepped through the doors together, the light of the foyer spilling out to meet them, a final, definitive victory over the night. The story that had begun with a shattered heart had ended with a legacy of unbreakable strength. And as the doors clicked shut behind them, the world outside continued to spin, forever changed by the two men who had dared to turn a heartbreak into a revolution.